Morning, church. A real joy to be with you this morning. If you bumped into me and I had my card, my wrapping paper, and my balloons, where might I be off to? A party, exactly. That's right. And Jesus once described our lives as the days leading up to a great party. And if you remember that story, it confounded expectations, though. You would have thought that the hardest part was receiving the invite to a great party. But when Jesus tells the story, the hardest part was deciding to turn up to the party. People were too caught up in their transactions to respond to the great invitation of grace. You remember it maybe, I've bought a field, or I've just bought cows, or I've just got married. And congratulations to those in our midst who have bought land or animals or been married recently. But what we just heard in our reading was the writing of Paul, Silas, and Timothy, three missionaries who'd left everything behind, messaging a church gathering, who were in the process of working out how to live transformed lives with a 9-to-5. And they'd received that great invitation to the party, and they were needing some encouragement and guidance from these three missionary church planters. The church was asking, any idea, how do we keep at this until we meet with Christ? Over August, we're looking at the end of this letter to the church in Thessalonica, and we're pulling out 4 different practices for our spiritual growth. They are daily reminders of our identity and our calling. And today we're beginning this series with expectation. That's the title. And we're going to travel through 1 Thessalonians 5, 8-11 with these 3 objects, the card, and then the wrapping paper, and then finally the balloon. And we're going to see that the card, very simply put, reminds us to read hope. The wrapping paper teaches us to wear hope, and the balloon to carry hope. Let's start with the card. For the first passage in our series is actually picking up the tail end of one of Paul's cards. Maybe you didn't know that. That's what we're looking at the very end of verses 8-11. And what does it say, this card? Maybe not what we expect. Can anyone make that out? With sympathy. That's strange. Why do you need a card that says with sympathy on the way to a party? Well, when we look in the contents of this condolences card, we'll see what Paul's message is. Remember, in these cards, you've only got about 30 to 50 words to try and say something meaningful. And in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, all the way to the end of 5:11, we get the first ever Christian condolence card. And here's my summary of it in about 50 words. Dear Thessalonians, I heard that some of your church have died. Well, remember that Christ dying is a promise of our rising, and we who remain will one day meet him too, gathered together in between heaven and earth. Christ belongs to the day, and now you do too, so live like it. Paul, Silas, and Timothy. And that was the message, but you see, this card wasn't the only one written that decade. And I suspect that Paul, Silas, and Timothy would have known of the other big card writer of his time. Here he is. I'm sure we all recognize him. You see, this man was a kind of contemporary of Paul's. He'd been traveling around the Roman Empire and was in the habit of writing to people too. His name was Seneca, a name that was increasingly being known. In fact, in the very years that Paul was writing to the Thessalonians, 2 things of note had happened. This man, Seneca, had become tutor to the future emperor Nero. That was quite an unusual arrangement at the time. And secondly, Paul had got to know the family when he'd run into Seneca's brother, Gallio. And you can read about it in Acts 18 as the 3 preached. In Corinth, it's the place from which Paul, Silas, and Timothy are writing this very letter, having just bumped into his brother. Seneca, this rising star, he'd written 3 very long condolence cards in the last decade. And just about the time that this letter to the Thessalonians was written, these letters had begun to be read more widely. And one of the condolence cards of note was to his mother, Helvia. It's always a tricky thing to write the right words to your mum, or even, to be honest, to be in contact with her. But Seneca, obviously a very good son, he decides, while he was far out in exile, without hope of return, to write a condolences card to his mother. And maybe Helvia, after she had read it, wished that he hadn't written in the first place, because these were the words of comfort from her son. He said, "Mother, life never lets a good thing last." And I don't know whether she laughed or cried as she read that, but church, this is still the air that our fearful hearts breathe 2,000 years later. And I get it. I hear about the next cancer diagnosis, the next person cheating in their marriage, the next failed exam. It piles up and it hurts. And so often when people want to say words of comfort that they feel aren't meaningless platitudes, we hear again those old words of Seneca. Oh well, life never lets a good thing last. And it's funny because when we say life never lets a good thing last, we're actually talking about our expectations, aren't we? For most of us, for most of the time, we hold a sense that we can rely on events turning out according to how we plan and control, that we're not going to have our children run up to us in the middle of our preach. And yet, we know in moments of searing clarity that pain and grief find us all. And so our expectations, they place us in this funny limbo. On the one hand, we believe that the goodness we enjoy, it's a satisfaction from a predictable process. It will produce what we have the right to claim. That's Ivan Illich in Deschooling Society. Basically, I've earned this good stuff. And yet, on the other hand, we experience a frustration of our expectations. And there's no way to explain what we're supposed to do with that frustration. Ironically, it's our expectations that can make us the least fruitful. We become trapped, or to use Jesus' image in another of his parables, we become choked by the very things we thought would bear us fruit. Take 2 examples. We want to provide security for our family, but then that provision of wealth becomes the thing we crave more than the family we sought it for in the first place. Or how about this? We want to enjoy the privilege of study, but we find ourselves mired in anxiety about our final results. And I, honestly, have felt the scratch of each of these thorns over my life. But in God's mercy, I'm seeking to become thorn-proof. And this is a daily habit. So here is our first bit of advice. If you want to make it to the great party, take this condolence card with you. You see, true expectation is set by remembering Christ's story. We read again the startling honesty and reality of Psalms. We journey with this living book which knows of life's trials and triumphs. We hear again the message from the apostles to the Christians living their 9-to-5s in Thessalonica, Galatia, and all around the area. And the message is this: reset your expectations. We're not to be without grief, but neither are we to be without hope. You see, if your life is only about what you intend for it, well, expect it to get choked by those thorns. If your life is about imitating Christ's life, well, expect it to bear fruit 30, 60, 100-fold. Let us get these words deep into our souls. So we move to the second thing, and I'll open it onto its shiny side. What's the wrapping paper for, anyone? It's for a present. And as any good present giver knows, well, the gift isn't really about the gift, is it? It's about the person. And that's what this party is all about. It's not about the gift. It's about Jesus. And if expectations let us down, well, then expectation, it lifts us up. Even Illich, this Catholic theologian, described it like this: hope centers desire on a person from whom we await a gift. Hope centers desire on a person from whom we await a gift. That's our expectation. You see, Seneca thought that life would never let a good thing last. Well, Paul responds that Christ lets his good life last, and he invites us to share it. Christ, whose life delved down through death and is risen up to heaven again. Christ who leads us in his victorious train if we'll but join him. It's all grace. It's all gift. The gospel is the message of our hope, and Christ is the subject. We hope in a person whose death has triggered life. That's how the message puts 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 10. You see, Jesus lives that we'd have power to die to ourselves daily. He reigns to free us from the tyranny of our expectations, and he dwells in our heart that we might hope in him. Our passage reminds us that the great gift we are awaiting is his gift of rescue. But just when we think we've heard it all before, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, they give us two surprises in our passage, don't we? Well, firstly, what is the wrapping paper? Well, if we look at 1 Thessalonians 5:8 again, we'll see it. We're to be wrapped or clothed in what on the way to a party? Well, we're told to wrap up in 2 pieces of armor. That's strange. And if you've ever been to Warwick Castle, the 2 bits of wooden armor that your 6-year-old nephew comes away with are the sword and the shield, right? Classic armor. You can't go wrong with a bit of sword and shield. That's enough to get a bit of a good play fight going. But despite what it may seem to the world outside, our expectation is not to spend our journey towards God engaging in play fighting. God forgive us when that's how we spend our days. Rather, Paul says, we're given to wear 2 things for the protection of our head and our heart. Without sword or shield or even sandals, the Thessalonians are to be barefoot pilgrims. That's bold. And that's coming from someone who's trod on a bee barefoot this week. And I think this slimmed down list is deliberate. It's not the full suite of armor we might recognize from Ephesians 6. Because when it comes to our expectation in Christ, there's no need to attack to win. When we're dressed like this, we're protected for our journey. When we're wrapped in faith, hope, and love, we're thorn-proof. Those tangling briars of our expectation, well, they don't scratch us like they did before. Second surprise, what is wrapped up? The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that you don't actually go to a party with wrapping paper. That's a little bit naff. What's missing? A gift. Obviously, a gift. And that's the second surprise from our passage. It's one of the themes of 1 Thessalonians. There is no gift because we become a gift. Often, Paul used the image of receiving the gift of a crown when we meet Jesus, like a victorious athlete. That was the gold medal of its day. But what is the crown in 1 Thessalonians? Well, in chapter 2, Paul, Silas, and Timothy write this. For what is our hope, our joy, or the crown in which we glory in the presence of our Lord Jesus when he comes? Is it not you? Indeed, you are our glory and our joy. You see, we become like the very thing we are hoping for. We become a gift even as we await the great gift. And I pray that we at All Saints may cause the saints eternal to rejoice. So the second habit for spiritual growth is this. Dress yourself in hope and be grace to someone in need of the gift. See, the act of loving kindness and expectation of hope, they're tied together. You see, our acts are connected to our expectation. This is going to crinkle horribly as I try and put it neatly on there. I'm just going to tuck it down here, but it's part of the what we're taking to the party. Because hope and love are connected. What we believe in influences how we behave. And John of the Ladder, the author of one of the oldest Christian Lent books ever, he said this: hope is the power behind love. And when hope fails, so does love. Hope is the power behind love. And when hope fails, so does love. That's why it's so key that we're wrapped up, protected for this journey, so that our hope doesn't fail. And so long as our hope doesn't fail, church, neither will our love. And lastly, the bit we've all been waiting for, the balloon. What's the balloon for? Good question. Well, cards give people our message, don't they? Presents show people our love. But what do balloons do? Well, it's technically the giving of our breath. And I think it reminds us that we are to be people of up by God's breath. Clive last week encouraged us to wake up. And did you spot from our passage that we are to be people who are up and about in the daylight, who build each other up? And one of the challenges doing this practically in Christian community is swapping hot air for up air. You'll remember that Seneca, that great card writer of Paul's day, he really didn't want to be known for a load of hot air, so much so that he even deflated his own mother's expectation while she was thinking about her son stuck in exile. But you see, Paul, he responds that very same decade with a counter practice. And he tells it to the church in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 19. Do not quench the Spirit. Now, quench means do not put out, but how can you put out breath or wind? Well, here's a simple physical analogy. Here's a tank of compressed gas. And the way you quench it is to shut the tap off here. There you go, you can see the green tap. And I'm going to call for an assistant who is expecting this to come up and help me. You see, the way you can quench it is to shut the tap here, but the way you can use it is by filling up balloons. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5:19, do not turn the tap off on the Spirit. You see, our expectation when we come to faith is that we're gifted with a different substance within us. What we have inside us is not our own hot air. No, church. We have God's divinity in our humanity. From the outside, it may not look like anything unusual is happening within. It looks just the same as any kind of air. Thank you. And can you tie it? It looks just the same as air that I might have blown up from my mouth. But God's divinity in our humanity, it does something very special. Something that we're celebrating as we go on the way to a party. Because when God releases us, we act out of our expectation. For the Christian's true range is not to rest deflated on the floor. In fact, in his condolence card, remember, Paul described the true end of Christians as meeting Christ in the air, halfway between this earth and those heavens, somewhere like the ceiling in this analogy. And I think that's a really helpful posture for our daily practice. We are to be filled together so that we rest in between heaven and earth. You see, the reason that we're halfway between is that we're wholly committed to the earth's renewal. And as we enjoyed just moments ago, we're wholly comfortable in the heavenly worship of God. And most of you did it already, but what happens to others when we're filled with the up air of God? Well, people look up. And I pray that what they observe in us is not us desperately trying to swim up, straining every sinew to be outwardly perfect. No, I pray that they observe instead that we are drifting up, because by Christ's death, there's a God-given newness of the life within us. Something different is filling us up, that we are signaling and anticipating the coming of a great party. That's the expectation that we have, church. We're invited to join God's great party at the consummation of all things. The challenge, just as Jesus laid out in his parable, is responding daily to say yes, 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 to keep asking for the renewing spirit in our world grown old. So here's the daily habit, the third daily habit to keep us growing spiritually. Ask to be renewed by the Spirit every day. You see, Seneca may have been far more famous than Paul in his lifetime, but what a difference in those final years between those two condolence card writers. You see, both died in Rome in the mid-60s AD, but have a look at how Seneca's life ended when you get home. You see, for Paul, however, in the final decade of his life, he said this about following his master Jesus. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. That's the expectation of daily renewal, to fill us and carry us upward, to make us a wrapped gift, and to make our lives like Christ. For as much as we share in his suffering now, we trust that so much then will be raised with him in glory. Amen.